All right, we're ready to start?
Yeah, we're live and we're ready to go.
Wonderful. Sorry about the delay. So all our participants are here as well, I assume.
Yep.
All right, welcome everyone. So my name's Chris Buttle. I do apologize for the slight delay in getting going. This is an extremely large event here on the WebEx platform. So welcome to our town hall. This is a town hall to bring people, get people up to date in terms of what our fall planning is looking like. As a reminder, with an event of this size, you're not able to use your video or audio, but there is a Q&A box, and that's the feature that you can use to submit any questions that you might have. I want to thank you for being here today. There are definitely updates to provide you with, because there's been, as you know, recent government announcements and information that we really feel important to share with all of you. And we're going to be offering a short presentation that Fabrice Lebeau will deliver in a few minutes. It will give an update of current status as we look to the fall term. And after the presentation, we will certainly work on answering all the questions that you might have. And we've received hundreds of questions in advance. Thank you for those of you who submitted questions, and we'll certainly do our best to get through as many questions as possible. And again, as a reminder, you can put your additional questions into the Q&A box. And I think with that, because we're a little bit delayed, we're going to move immediately to the presentation, and Fabrice will deliver that. It'll take about 20 minutes, and then we'll start the Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
So I assume that the screen sharing worked here and that you can see my screen. So this is, as we've already said, this is an update with respect to what we have been announcing in the past in terms of fall 2021 planning. And so let me start this update with a sense of where we are and what is new since the last time we spoke to the whole community about fall 2021 planning. So what's new since last month? There's basically two main areas. The first one where there is big news is the vaccination rollout. As you see here, in terms of the vaccination rollout, the provincial goal here in Quebec of reaching 75% of adults having received a first dose was set to be reached by the end of June. It will actually be reached by the middle of June, and so we're ahead of schedule there. So that's good news. The other very good news that has been announced in this area by the government not too long ago is an accelerated goal for administering the second doses. And now we have a goal in the province to reach 75% of the individuals who have had a second dose by end of August, which is roughly the start of our term. The other good news, and that makes it even more exciting, is the fact that we have added to these goals the population of people aged 12 to 17. And so they're now part of the vaccination campaign. Now, when we say we're trying to get 75% second dose by end of August, that includes that population too. The other important area where there's been news since last month is, of course, the government directives. You may have seen the reopening plan that the province of Quebec has disclosed, I think it was 10 days ago now. It basically states that there's now projected dates for the different regions of Quebec to move from the current red alert level to orange, yellow, green. If you're in Quebec, you will have seen that most regions have actually moved to orange as of Monday. Monday next week, the Montreal area will be moving to orange. And so we expect that by the end of June, beginning of July, we will end up with most regions in Quebec at the green alert level, which is the lowest alert level in the pandemic alert levels of the province, which means a lot more things will be allowed to happen in person starting when we move to green alert level. Other big news, which is extremely important from the perspective of our fall planning, is this notion that once we reach 75% of the second doses in the population, then there may be lifting of some public health restrictions and directives. So in our case, for the higher education sector, the target population we're looking at is the population age 16 to 29 years. And when we reach the threshold of 75% vaccination, so fully vaccinated people in that target population, and if indeed we have a stable epidemiological situation, then we will move to no distancing. So we will not have restrictions on indoor activities where people will have to be physically distanced. Whether or not that will imply that we keep or remove masks is still something that will be determined later, and then we will be able to inform you of that as we have more information. So in terms of the news, that's the two main areas that have an influence on our planning. What does that mean for our planning? So if you have been following our announcements regarding planning, it is clear that you've seen us talk about 5 possible scenarios. We have defined 5 scenarios from the most pessimistic possible, what we called red alert, to the most optimistic, with the one we called optimistic. And we've been really planning for these 5 scenarios to be a possible realization of what happens in September. Based on this, and based on the news we have had in the last 2 weeks, I think it's fair to say now that we can work with a realistic scenario and realize that scenario, and at some point transition to an optimistic scenario. So let me try and explain what I mean by this. We are still planning for the realistic scenario to be our baseline scenario. That's a scenario that implied the idea that all at-risk people would have been vaccinated and a sizable percentage of the population would also have been vaccinated. It deploys our activity in September with 1 meter distancing everywhere, and it requires masks to be worn throughout campus all the time. It also assumes that most activities will be allowed, but that there would be a limit on non-essential gatherings. So this is our default scenario. We now know that the minute we will reach that threshold of 75% full vaccination in our target population, we'll be able to ramp up to actually deploy what we call the optimistic scenario. So the optimistic scenario has no distancing, may or may not have mask wearing, but clearly that we'll see a move to few to no restrictions on the activities we can carry out, and we'll be allowing gatherings. And so this transition will depend on when we reach the threshold of 75% fully vaccinated individuals with, again, a stable epidemiological situation. But what we can foresee from what we see from the government announcements is that the timing of this transition, this threshold being achieved, is going to be around the start of term. So a bit before the start of term or a bit after the start of term. The ramp up we see here in between, we imagine it's going to take us maybe 2 weeks to move from the deployment of the realistic scenario to the optimistic scenario. If things don't go as expected in September, I think it's important for everybody to realize that we have the optimistic scenario that will be running at some point in the months of September. If things go bad, we can always go back to the realistic scenario, so we'll move from 0 distancing to 1 meter distancing. And if things go really, really bad, and in case unspeakable things happen, we can always move back to the red alert kind of scenario. Sorry, the red alert kind of scenario. But what we see playing out is realistic moving into optimistic. So that's the planning high-level view of all this. But what does it mean in terms of our academic activities? In terms of the academic activities, we've already announced a lot of things related to the realistic scenario. We've said very clearly that that all students and instructors in Montreal have to, all students and instructors have to be in Montreal for in-person activities, because indeed there will be a lot of in-person activities even if we stick to the realistic scenario. What we've said is that all lectures that are over 150 people will be delivered online, while all the other activities will be delivered in person with 1 meter distancing. That means that 60 to 65% of all academic activities will end up being in person. We've had a lot of questions around this notion of large lectures being delivered online, and students asking us whether they can cherry pick their courses to only have these activities and then they don't need to be on campus. I want to remind everybody that it is not the case. We will definitely have exams in person for a lot of these activities, even if we were to stick to the realistic scenario. So it's important that everybody be in Montreal for in-person activities come September. One additional thing about this this situation that I'm describing here, the realistic scenario, 1 meter distancing for 60 to 65% of our activities in person. This is the current schedule that you can see online. So as of June 1st, we had opened registration for students for the fall courses. If you are a student and you've been there on the website to register for your courses, you've seen that some courses have a room allocated to them. These are the ones that we know will be in person, part of this 60 to 65% of activities. The ones that don't have a room allocated are the ones that currently are scheduled to be remote. Now, what happens when we cross that 75% threshold and we ramp up to optimistic in terms of the academic activities? Well, we will go to a new room allocation that will be deployed where we will allocate rooms to classes in such a way that we are back to 0 meter distancing. So we will not be changing the day and time of day of an activity. If you're now looking at a course and it is offered Tuesdays at 10:30, it will remain Tuesday at 10:30, but it may change room. And the fact that we'll be rechanging rooms to now move to 0 meter distancing it's actually going to free up more space on our campus, and we anticipate we'll be able to bring back more activities in person. So we anticipate that in that case we'll be able to go up to 75 to 80% of academic activities in person. We still expect that most of the very large lectures will remain online, and that the primary candidates to coming to in person from remote are also the courses that are smaller than 150 people, but that we didn't have space to fit in the current schedule. So that's what's going to happen for academic activities. What's going to happen for research? In the realistic scenario, we're looking again at the 1 meter distancing in the labs and research spaces that are shared. And we are putting a cap on occupancy of 2/3 of normal occupancy. Once we ramp up to optimistic, we will be, of course, working with no distancing, which will allow us to progressively increase the occupancy to 100%. What does that mean for our admin and support staff that are working from home? Well, if you remember what we've discussed earlier about the realistic scenario, we were really aiming to start at 30% initial minimum occupancy. So 30% of our admin and support staff would be back on campus, or at least there's 30% of the level of occupancy would be what we would be aiming for the beginning of the term. And that would be the realistic scenario. But now we know that at some point we'll transition and ramp up to the optimistic scenario, which would allow us to move to 100% occupancy. So the difference between just doing realistic and doing realistic moving into optimistic is that the increase of presence from the initial 30% to a final 100% may actually be happening over a shorter period of time. So we'll see that increase, I assume, over the course of the month of September once we do the ramp up from realistic to optimistic. We realize that this requires a lot of preparation in order to get to the 30% initial minimum occupancy in the realistic scenario by mid-August, so we're ready for the fall. There's a big preparation phase that is going to be starting very soon. As we move to the orange level in the Montreal area, there's going to be orientation and planning for supervisors so that they can think about preparing the space for the return of their team, preparing the team schedule for the return. And we'll distribute to supervisors a return to campus toolkit and other supports to make sure that they know how to make these things happen consistently, so according to central guidelines, but also adapted locally to what is necessary there. As we move to the yellow or green alert level, we'll be having the supervisors move to campus to prepare for the on-campus return. So putting in place the signage, preparing the space, etc., so that staff can progressively return to campus a bit at a time. So we reached the 30% initial minimum occupancy by mid-August, and we're ready to start the semester. And after that, when we cross the 75% full vaccination threshold, we'll be able to ramp up to optimistic and to 100% occupancy without distancing. In terms of the another point that is important for our staff, when we go back to the optimistic scenario with 100% occupancy, we have already said that the usual flexible work arrangement program will be back. Now, what we can also announce is that early this summer, the office that is in charge of the new model of work at McGill will actually make recommendations for interim guidelines for an improved flexible work arrangement program. We don't have the details of what this is going to look like, but there's going to be news coming to the community, I would say around the beginning of the month of July, about what this new flexible work arrangement program may be, and it will start kicking in as we get to 100% occupancy in the optimistic scenario. What it means for events and extracurricular activities, if you remember what we said for the realistic scenario, we said events are allowed on an exceptional basis. And that means that most events won't be allowed to take place because either there's actual restrictions that prevent these events from happening, or we simply don't have the resources on campus. The people who typically help with these events will be mobilized to make sure the rest of the campus is carrying out its activities safely. And so diverting these resources to running events is going to be very difficult. So on an exceptional basis. As we ramp up to the optimistic scenario, we expect that events will be allowed. There may be some additional restrictions, but overall, by and large, the events will be allowed. So the main issue here, of course, is that we don't know exactly when this transition and ramp up will happen. It may happen right before we start the semester or a bit after we start the semester. And so for event organizers who are typically organizing events in the last week of August or the first week of September, our current advice is to reconsider the event itself and try to see if it can be pushed to the second half of September, because at that point in time, there's a much higher likelihood that we'll be actually in the optimistic scenario and will have done the transition. A quick reminder about health and safety. So the first point here is about the 75% vaccination target. If you're in Quebec, you've heard a lot of talk about this in the media, saying this the minute we reach 75% vaccination rates, then everything is lifted, no distance. You can go visit your grandmother, do whatever you want. That's not exactly the case. The first thing we definitely need to realize here is that the 75% target for us in a university is not the general population. It's the 16 to 29-year-old people that would be that have to reach that threshold of 75% full vaccination. And the second portion is that it's not just the vaccination numbers that count. We also need to be in a very stable situation from the perspective of the transmission of the virus. So the number of cases has to be low and remain low. So if these two conditions are not met, then some restrictions will likely be maintained, and we may remain at the realistic scenario for a longer time. Also want to tell everybody who has not been on campus for a long time, remind everybody that we have been putting safety measures in place and they have been working. So we've been very careful, and it has paid off. So we've had, since the beginning of September 2020, had approximately 3,000 people in person on campus each day. The only transmissions we've seen are outbreaks in our residences, so people not following rules. But if you look at our staff or students who have had activities on campus, so in their work, teaching activities, research activities, there's been absolutely no transmission. So we've been careful, we'll continue being careful, and we'll continue providing an environment that is inherently safe. Expectations of things that you may see over the summer. So first, there's going to be reopening of things in the province, and we will follow along in the university, and we'll be preparing for a larger reopening in the fall. We know that everybody is used to restrictions, so we know it's going to take a while for everybody to adjust. That's expected. We know there's anxieties, and that's why we're really talking about this now, so we can slowly work together and transition together to a more open and more normal set of activities. What you will see on campus over the summer is increased activities in some areas, including research and some of our staff returning to work progressively. We will have more and more discussions at a more local level. So your faculty, your unit leads, your supervisors will give you more detailed information as we get closer to making this happen for real. The other change that you may see if you're a student or a teaching staff is that some of the activities, the teaching activities that are currently scheduled to be online, well, they may see a room allocated to them at some point during the summer as we conclude that we'll indeed move from the realistic to the optimistic scenario. And of course, we'll continue keeping you informed through ongoing communications. So I think I can, at this point, just thank you for your attention, but also remind you of one thing, is that all this, if we want to go back to a more normal way of working together, of teaching, of learning, etc., it relies on everybody's efforts. And so it all relies on the fact that we all get vaccinated. So get vaccinated, please, as soon as you can. So I'll stop the presentation here. We'll go into the Q&A, but I have one last slide that I think we can leave up there while we're answering the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fabrice, and thank you again, everyone, for attending today. I did want to remind all of you that this is being recorded, and this will be available in the coming days online. And many of the questions that have come in are also available under the FAQ section of the coronavirus website at McGill, and that will be updated as well later this week with kind of the return to campus section of that site being populated. So please check that website regularly. You'll find many of your questions will be addressed directly on that website. So I think what we're going to do for the next half hour is run through quite a lot of the questions that we've received, both in advance and some of the questions that are coming through the Q&A feature on this WebEx platform. And maybe, Fabrice, I'll take the first couple of questions. And you mentioned this, but I think it's worth reiterating. One of the questions from students are, how will I know if my class is remote or in person? And if you are registering, many students are registering right now because registration opened for many faculties on the 1st of June. If there's a room allocation when you go to register, then that class is currently scheduled in person. If there's no room allocation, it's currently scheduled for online. Now, one thing that's important to mention is this might change in the coming weeks. So you have to be prepared for checking back and looking at whether or not you do end up having a room allocation. And then, of course, the expectation would be that you would go to that room when the term starts in September. We're going to do our very best to keep everyone informed and actually have a plan with respect to what that beginning of the term looks like in terms of your room allocations. And students that are in classes that are over 150 in size, that's the threshold over which we had a default position for online delivery of lectures. Most of those are likely to remain for online delivery, but perhaps not all of them. So again, this is one of those situations that might evolve over time, and that's why it's important to check back closer to the start of term around whether or not you get a room allocation. And it's again, we would love to have certainty. We're living in an area where there is uncertainty, of course. So, but we're planning in a way that makes sure we have as much clarity as possible before the start of term, and so that it's as least disruptive as possible as well. Maybe I'll address the next question to you, Fabrice. It's about an international student. Many students are looking to book their flights on jet planes and figure out how to get to Montreal and start their term. What's the situation with respect to vaccinations, or what's the best estimate in terms of students who might come with perhaps only one dose, or perhaps unvaccinated? What do you think the procedure will be with that? And so maybe more generally, let's think about international students arriving and some comments that perhaps you can have on that.
So I think there's several questions that we get a lot from international students. So indeed, coming to Montreal with varying vaccination status, what's going to happen to you? Will there still be a quarantine, etc.? So I think at a high level, let me talk about the quarantine first. So currently, there is a 2-week quarantine as you come into Canada. We're expecting that will change over time, but we have really no indication of a timeline here. So I would really advise everybody to still plan for the 2-week quarantine to happen. So make your plan so that you're there 2 weeks in advance, because there's a good chance it will be there. I mean, if it's not there anymore, well, it's all good news. But I think at this point in time, because there's no indication of timelines for change, it's safer to plan for the 2-week quarantine. In terms of vaccination, we've heard a lot of these questions, and I realize that the vaccination schedules are very different in different countries. The availability of vaccines are very different. If you're coming from outside Quebec and you come into Quebec, the minute you land, you're part of the vaccination campaign in Quebec. So there is a process that the public health has put together here in Quebec to declare your status of vaccination. So if you have had one vaccine, let's say in another province in Canada, you go to a website and you declare, I've had this vaccine, and then you're enrolled in the program and you'll be able to schedule your second dose. We are still in discussions with public health to finalize the details of how this is going to happen. But part of the idea for people who would come to Canada without vaccine at all is to get them vaccinated first dose as soon as possible when they land. And so the reassuring piece in all that is that definitely the minute you step foot on Quebec land, you will be part of the Quebec provincial vaccination campaign, and so that's going to be taking over where it left off in your home country.
Yeah, thanks, Fabrice. And we've certainly had questions from students from other provinces as well. So you addressed that also, that the idea of getting vaccinated when you come to Quebec is one that you can assume can happen and will happen. That's definitely very, very clear. Another question maybe I'll take, Fabrice, is about whether students can start their studies online, or why would they have to come if their lectures are posted as being online? And I think the answer there is it's still a changing dynamic. So some of those activities that are currently posted as being online might switch to in-person if we're able to do so. So that's one very important piece. And that really is reflective of the statements that we've been making since February about the expectations that students be here for the fall term. And also it's we're also planning in many cases to have in-person assessments, whether it's tests or midterms or final exams. Many of those will be in person. So even if some of your lectures are online, other activities such as exams, but also things like labs, tutorials, conferences, etc., will be available in person. And so another question maybe I'll just address quickly. Some students have asked about what about studying or following an online lecture on campus. And certainly the goal will be to make sure that, especially under the optimistic scenario, there'll be lots of space available for students to study on campus and follow lectures on campus, et cetera. So that's definitely part of the planning as well. So you might have, for example, 2 lectures in person, and in the middle have a lecture that's remote delivered, and we'll be able to find space to follow that lecture remotely. Next question is related to staff. What does a full return really mean? Is this all staff or just staff that are doing work that's front facing with students? Can you speak to that a little bit, and perhaps maybe also talk a bit about whether there might be changes to the space that staff might be occupying on that kind of return to campus scenario?
So when we're talking about full return of staff and 100% and things like that, then we're really talking about back to pre-COVID, pre-pandemic levels. So people who are working on campus will come back to campus. I think there may be some changes, reconfiguration of the spacing. That's part of the preparation for a realistic scenario when we will still have distancing restrictions. But as we move into the optimistic scenario, then I think the spaces may be back to their normal status very quickly. I think I'll add to that the question of the flexible work arrangement also, because I see in the Q&A some questions pop by about, I've said there would be an announcement, and then can we have a preview of what the flexible work arrangement, the new program will look like? And I really have to tell you, we don't know yet. So I think the group is starting to work on this. I mean, you can assume as a baseline that the current flexible work arrangement will still be in place, and there's going to be improvement on top of that.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll take this some more questions related to vaccinations, and the question talks a little bit around how we know so far the answer has been that no, McGill will not likely have a proof of vaccination program in place. That answer is still the same, but maybe the question is a little bit more nuanced around that. I mean, one of the questions comes from a student saying, will I be able to come to campus if I only have one dose of vaccination, for example? So maybe Fabrice, you could just generally paint us a portrait of the question related to vaccination or proof of vaccination.
Yeah, so I think as you said, Chris, it's still the case that we don't plan to require proof of vaccination, and I will remind everybody that, for instance, vaccination is not mandatory in Quebec. But the world we're returning to, and especially that world in the optimistic scenario where we cross that 75% threshold of double vaccination, is a world where public health is actually telling us it's safe to actually interact with no distancing, because there's so many people who will be vaccinated that the likelihood of a transmission of the virus becomes something that is easily tolerable at a population level, meaning that even with some people unvaccinated in the middle of a lot of vaccinated people, it's still a safe environment. So the default is indeed that if you have only one dose of vaccine, you will be able to come to campus. We don't intend at this time to make any difference between people who have two doses or one dose of vaccine, or even zero.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions from graduate students. I think they're dreaming of coming back and getting that burnt coffee from the corner kitchen in the floor of their research building, and imagining what it looks like to do research in a more vibrant research environment. The question is really about whether graduate students will have to kind of continue to think about shifting their schedule, because in some cases there's kind of shift work in labs because of the way that we're set up with the physical distancing now. And I think really the answer there is, as we move to that optimistic scenario, as Fabrice mentioned, it's really going to be much more back to normal for research activities. And so I think graduate students can anticipate a full return to those research activities, either right around the start of fall or very soon into the start of fall. So I wanted to give the graduate students a shout out there and let you know that yes, you're on our minds as well. And some of you have had some challenges, of course, getting your research done, and we're pretty confident that will really shift as we move to that optimistic scenario. A question that's come up in the chat, Fabrice, as well, has been about this 75%, and we think of the 75% in many different ways. And one of the questions really about how we interpret or understand the 75% for our population, because our population is not necessarily reflective of the population in Montreal at large or in Quebec at large, and largely because we have so many international students, et cetera. So maybe you could speak to how we interpret that 75% in terms of that threshold.
Absolutely. So the public health threshold, as I mentioned, is going to be in the region of Montreal. 75% of the 16 to 29-year-olds have received the full vaccination. So 2 doses, a dose plus a recovery from the virus, etc. And at our level, we will basically follow that threshold. But I realize that there may be doubts about whether or not we'll be at the same level in the population at McGill, because we have an overrepresentation of people from outside the province of Quebec. Very quickly, I think we can say that if we're not at 75% at that point in time, we'll be very close in terms of 1 or 2 percentage points, because, well, first anybody who's currently in Quebec, so even our international students who have been in Quebec and have not returned home, they're part of the current vaccination campaign, so they'll be at the 75%. Or out of province students, so they're coming from the rest of Canada, they will be in the vaccination campaign of their respective provinces in Canada. And Quebec is a bit ahead of everybody right now, but we're talking a couple of percentage points again. So the level of vaccination of people coming in from the rest of Canada is going to be around 75%. Now, the question remains for our international students, of course, the international population, especially those who will be coming to Montreal for the first time in August in preparation for the fall semester. We expect that, of course, the penetration of vaccination will vary by country in a significant way. But again, as we will be including these people as they come in the vaccination campaign of the province, and trying to get them vaccinated as early as possible if they're coming in without a vaccine. That should put us in a position that we're anyway very close to the Montreal average in that from that perspective.
Great, thank you. We have some questions about masks, and in your presentation you talked about the situation around masks is still unknown with respect to that shift to that optimistic scenario. One of the questions comes from an instructor, whether or not they can demand or require students to wear masks, even if it's not determined mandatory by the government. And the other question is about if it's still required to have masks, will McGill be providing masks in the way that we've done over the last little while? So maybe you can speak just about masks in general.
So maybe to answer the question about provision of masks, so we're gearing up for the realistic scenario first, in which masks are worn everywhere. So we're gearing up for providing masks to the whole community. So the idea is to have mask distributors at the entrance of buildings where people can take their masks. They're 2 masks for the day when they come in. So that's typically what we're doing when there's a mandate for masks. As to what's going to happen once we move past the 75% threshold and maybe public health lifts the requirement to wear masks, I'm clearly expecting that in the next few months, even if there's no public health requirement, a large portion of our community will make the personal choice to continue wearing a mask. And I think, well, that's exactly how we will have to consider it at that point in time. It's going to be a personal choice. So some people will feel safer having a mask for a few months after we go back to a more normal life. Some people will be happy to not wear the masks as soon as the directive, the mandate on wearing masks will be lifted. And I think we'll have to acknowledge all these possibilities. I don't think it would make sense if we don't have a mandate on masks for an individual instructor to mandate mask wearing in their classroom.
Thank you. Next question is about contingencies. There are some areas talk about 4th wave, and some others people in the chat have asked about, whether or not if things get sort of bad again in the fall, new variants, whatever the case may be, what contingencies do we have in place? And I just do want to remind everyone that this past academic year, we were in that kind of red alert equivalent for most of the year. And so we already have a backup plan in that if we know how to be able to shift a lot of our activities to remote if necessary. And we're currently planning under the realistic scenario. And as we've talked about, we're looking at that ramp up to the optimistic scenario. But if there's a reason that we have to revert back to the realistic scenario, we're going to be able to do that. And that is the fundamental contingency plan, is if when we make that shift to optimistic, if there's a situation that happens in the fall where we need to change again, we will have that plan to revert back to. Any other comments on that, Fabrice?
No, I think it's important to realize that we have a backup and a backup of a backup. So I think this is prudent. We know that this pandemic has been generating surprises. We know there's going to be some peaks in cases that will come as we start reopening the province. That's completely predicted. But they should not be translating into massive levels of hospitalizations and in very adverse personal consequences for individual because of the presence of vaccination. And we know that there's always a possibility, however unlikely, that indeed there's a new variant that is more resistant to vaccination. So all this is part of the planning, is always having a backup, and in this case a backup and a backup of a backup.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a general question. I think maybe I'll take a stab at this as well, Fabrice. I mean, a lot of people are just worried. And we've been living in a state of a fairly restrictive movement and restrictive activities for such a long time. And a lot of people, whether it's a student traveling internationally, whether it's a staff member with concerns of their own, people are worried and concerned about what that return to campus looks like. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there is anxiety about this. I also think that we've got several months before the start of fall term, and as we gradually reopen in different parts of the world, and certainly within Quebec, I think people are going to get more used to being out there in the world again in different ways. And I think we want to move with you through this transition, and we want to make sure we set up all the different checkpoints so that people are feeling good about coming back. And that's part of the purpose of this presentation, is to give as much information as we have so that people can start to build up that confidence in what it looks like to return to campus. And certainly as Montreal moves to an orange zone and a green zone, coming back to campus and looking around, even if you're not coming to work on a particular day, walking through campus, coming to check out what it looks like, becoming familiar again with your workspaces progressively over the summer is all really going to help as we look to that transition. And for students as well, I had the opportunity to visit a lot of different classrooms over this academic term that were set up under what might be kind of like that realistic scenario. There's lots of signage, there's very clear demarcations, and if we are under that realistic scenario, we've really setting things up in a way to build confidence and make people feel comfortable in those spaces as we consider that return to campus. We know it's going to be hard for a lot of people, and people vary in their own personal views of what that looks like. But again, I think we have to take the long view and recognize that where we are today is very different than where we were 3 weeks ago, and it'll be different again in 3 weeks from now. I think we'll take a couple questions about events and activities, Fabrice. I mean, one comes from a smaller student club. I'm thinking of things like the culinary club, where you might want to try your new rhubarb cake recipe in spring. I mean, there's lots of people are kind of excited about new opportunities and getting back to clubs and activities. So how do clubs think about planning for some limited in-person activities? And the other part of that question is OAP and frosh. We're getting a lot of questions about those as well. So from the student's perspective, I want to think about running activities. What do we say at this point in time?
So I think I've alluded to some of that in the presentation. I think it depends on timing, and it depends a lot on what kind of activities. So if you're looking at a small student club and you have an activity with a few people, I don't know, maybe you're all playing the ukulele and learning to play an instrument together, 4 people, it's going to be easy to plan for that once we're past the transition and ramp up to the optimistic scenario. Big things like OAP and frosh, they're complicated in nature because it's a huge crowd. But from that perspective, it's so much easier to push them further along in the timeline to be able to start looking at actually planning them. Because if you're planning an event like OAP and frosh and you're saying, I want to do that the last week of August, as of today, there's absolutely no certainty we'll be in a position to do it, because we won't know if we won't know until maybe mid-August whether we or not we have crossed that 75% threshold. So I think everything looks very good as far as events and clubs are concerned as we move after the second half of September and the beginning of October.
Great, thank you. And a question related to staff. So in addition to sort of we talked about student activities as well. I mean, staff have questions about lunchrooms as well and access to other spaces. And I think it's, again, under the optimistic scenario, that more return to normal will, of course, include access to lots of different spaces they might normally consider using. The other question, though, is about this ramp up phase from the 30% to the 100%. What sort of time frame are we talking about in terms of a possible shift from that realistic to the optimistic?
So given the complexities that we have whenever we try to change something drastically in the university, we're thinking that at the moment we start crossing the threshold of 75%, and we know we can ramp up to optimistic, we're going to give ourselves 2 weeks to actually do that transition and be sure that we don't do everything instantaneously. We know it's always complicated. So 2 weeks will be the time we have to just turn around in every possible activity in the university and move from a restricted world to a far less restricted world. And as I mentioned, as we're looking at timelines, this transition may start at the beginning of September, first week of September. So I would say that by end of September, we can imagine that we'll all be in that optimistic scenario completely.
And a question now about accommodations, and we're getting this in terms of accommodations that students might be requesting because of possible COVID-related issues, or from an instructor who might perhaps be living with someone who they're concerned about their health and are worried about coming to campus for that reason. Maybe I'll speak to the student situation first. I think under the realistic framework, we're of course recognizing that under some extenuating circumstances, there might be individual cases with students that require some additional attention around accommodations. And so that's something we're certainly working on as part of our planning. As we move to optimistic, the need for that kind of framework becomes less so, because as we've talked about, the regular systems of how we do things will more or less be back in play. So I think for students, of course, we're building this into our planning for those individual cases that might require truly extenuating circumstances related to COVID. And maybe Fabrice, you can talk about maybe from an instructor's perspective, if they're having concerns about teaching in person for health reasons.
So that concerns instructors, but any of our staff members. I think if there's medical reasons why people cannot be working in their normal job in the normal way it's supposed to be carried out, there's always been accommodations for medical reasons. So that's still going to be in place as we come back in September and as we come back to more in person. So if you are an individual staff member, an instructor, or any of our admin and support staff, and you are in this position, we would basically advise you to talk to HR and especially to the benefits portion of HR, because they're the professionals who are dealing with these exemptions and these accommodations.
Great, thank you. That's very clear. We're at about 9 minutes left. I know hopefully we're getting through many of the questions. I know we're not doing all of them. We're doing our best, and I want to mention again, the FAQ site on the coronavirus website is a very good place to get additional information. I'll maybe take the next couple of questions. They're about kind of academic programs a little bit. From a student, they're asking, I still don't understand how we might switch to no physical distancing if we're at 1 meter distancing. How is this actually going to work? I don't want to get too granular here because it's, again, still part of the planning process, but our plan is that we have two basic schedules in place, right? The one that's currently exists, that students are currently registering for, which is based on that 1 meter physical distancing capacities, and that's the schedule that we're currently running with, and that's our realistic scenario. As the summer progresses, if things are looking good and we have an option to be able to recognize we're going to be switching to optimistic, we'll put in place the 0 meters, which is the back to normal schedule, where we'll put all the other activities into classrooms that we can, except for some of the larger classes that will likely remain through online delivery. So we're going to do our very best to make this not disruptive and have as much information as possible before term starts. In the event that we don't have, that we're in realistic at the start of term, and we may not shift to optimistic until sometime later in the term, we'll look at that closer to the start of the date. But again, we're going to try to do our best to not make too many changes. Although in some cases during the term, there might be some activities that end up getting a room allocation. Hopefully that part's been clear. I got a question about sit-down examinations. Will there be additional space between students or regular spacing? And again, the answer there is it depends on what scenario we're in. For midterm exams, we're not sure yet where we're going to be. So again, that might be with the 1 meter distancing, or it might be with regular spacing in an exam center. Although 1 meter could often be regular in terms of an examination, right? And final exams, I think we're optimistic that we're going to be able to schedule final exams more like we normally would in a pre-pandemic phase. We're going to evaluate that a little bit later on in the summer. The next question, will attendance in classes in the fall be contingent on students having a vaccination? So let's address that again, Fabrice, because we're still getting questions about that.
So I think indirectly, there's going to be an influence on the level of vaccination in our student population, because remember, we're going to change our ways from the realistic scenario 1 meter distancing to the optimistic scenario 0 meter distancing when we reach a threshold of vaccination in our target population that would be 75%. So yes, there is an influence, but we will not be preventing people from coming to campus if they are not fully vaccinated. So that's an important portion of the way it's going to work.
A question about small class teaching and outdoor spaces. So some profs have normally enjoyed taking their classes outside to teach. This is in a pre-pandemic phase, and the question is, can we plan on teaching outdoors in the fall? And I think, again, under the realistic scenario, that's still a scenario where we have restrictions in place. So we would not default to being able to teach in any space. That's really going to be a more controlled environment. If we're under the optimistic scenario, there could be opportunities for instructors to think about other kinds of teaching opportunities. But that again really comes down to whether or not we shift from that realistic to the optimistic scenario. A question about ventilation in the space. This comes from an instructor. They're worried about ventilation in the space they're supposed to teach in. What assurance is going to have about the building and the ventilation? Maybe we can address that as well.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to post in the chat the URL of the website where our facilities management, people have actually posted the situation with our HVAC systems and our ventilation systems, and it's segregated in terms of the kind of space and the kind of ventilation and the kind of actions that will be taken, are being taken, or should be taken in different areas. So at a high level, whenever we have a central ventilation system in a building, that's what we call a mechanically ventilated system. We know that these systems are inspected. We've done that for the last few months as we reopen our buildings. So we know that we're meeting all the standards that need to be met for the COVID type of operation. And that includes at 100% capacity. The other kinds of spaces that don't have central ventilation are that's what we call naturally ventilated spaces. If there are windows, we have recommendations on when to open the windows to make sure that there's enough of an airflow. And then finally, the remaining type of a space is a space that is naturally ventilated, so no central ventilation system, but that doesn't have windows or easy ways to make sure that there is a renewal of the air in the room. And that's when there's local assessment that has to be made, and we may actually limit the usage of these spaces depending on the number of people who will be in the spaces. So I think I'm trying to send reassuring messages here that this is something we have been looking at very clearly for several months as we were actually preparing to reopen for the previous fall, for the fall 2020. So it's something that we've had an eye on, and we know exactly our situation.
Okay, so Fabrice, we have 3 questions. We're going to try a rapid fire for the last few minutes to get through as many as we can. I'll take the first one. Winter 2022. The outlook there is everything's scheduled as normal, so as in a pre-pandemic state. What about study abroad or exchanges for winter, Fabrice?
So, well, it's up in the air, and it will really depend on the situation in the world. We know what's going to happen in Quebec. Rest of the world is still very much a question mark for us.
Athletics, intramural sports, varsity, any thoughts on that?
So everything that has to do with sports in the university, intramural or varsity, will depend on the reopening plans from the province about sports. So it's not really related to our own higher education plans. It's going to follow the reopening from orange, yellow, green levels. And so when we're at the green level, a lot of things are actually allowed.
This one might take more than 10 seconds, but are we thinking about ramping up monitoring or tracking on campus in the fall, since more people will be around on campus in the fall?
So that's something that I would say is not completely defined. The current assessment is that there may not be a need to ramp up the monitoring, because indeed the likelihood of outbreaks is going to be much smaller, but that's not something that is fully defined. So we're still looking at the possibilities and discussing internally with our scientists, but also with the Santé Publique here in Montreal.
And let's try for one more question, residence halls. So we've got a few incoming students posting questions about what's the plan? Will there be double occupancy? Will all the residence halls be open, etc.?
So as of now, we plan to open most of the residence halls with the full capacity for the hotel style residences and somewhat limited capacity for dorm style residences. So maybe 50 to 75% because in these areas, there's shared facilities. So that's really where we are at now in terms of residences, which means that if you are looking for a residence and you're a first year student, the first year guarantee still applies. So we will find you a residence.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. I want to thank everyone for the level of engagement and the questions, and it's hopefully we addressed many of your questions. I think for the students that are taking part, the message continues to be the same. We understand that there are, of course, some challenges as you think about a re-entry to university life or a new entry to university life. We're there to support you. We want you to get your plans together, plan on being here for the fall, and we're going to put in place everything we can to really provide that rich educational experience that we're known for. We're excited to have you here. I think for the staff on the call today, we know as well that there's some anxieties and worries about what a return to campus will look like. We hope it's a bit more clear today, and there'll be more information coming over the summer to help with that transition as we look to a return to that optimistic scenario. And also for others on the call, whether it's instructors or other members of the community that we haven't directly addressed, don't hesitate to reach out if you have other questions, and check out the FAQ site, and we'll continue to do our best to update you in the coming months. And we're very excited about the fact that we're looking at a different kind of fall term than what we might have imagined several months ago in the best kind of way. We're planning with safety as a priority, and also making sure our academic mission is always a priority as well. So Fabrice, I'll give the last word to you, and then we'll shut down things for today.
Well, so again, thank you all for attending. As you see, we do have plans. I think things are getting a lot more concrete than they were 2 months ago. We have a much better sense of what things are going to look like in September. We're really looking forward to seeing you all in person in September. It's going to make a big difference. So I think we're all excited about that.
Great, thanks. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining. Stay tuned.
Thank you, everybody.